Hello, everyone. I want to pick up where we left off on our last lecture concerning the translation of the scripture. Of course, we're looking at how translation has been affected over the centuries, taking the ancient languages of Hebrew and Greek, bringing them into modern languages, and ultimately to our own language, English, and looking at how that process has been affected over the different cultures, because we see that there is a difference in cultures. Doesn't take us a great deal of time or effort to identify that cultures have their own unique way of communication, whether it's even in body language, whether it's in phraseology, whether it's in sounds that we produce. But I'd like to develop that a little bit more today, but with the ultimate intent that we might come to understand meaning. And that's the real purpose of this, is understanding meaning. And interpretation, the part of the title of our course is interpretation, and that means that we're taking something that is somewhat outside of our realm of understanding, something that's foreign to us, and bringing it into our understanding and meaning. And that is how interpretation takes place. We took a look at the painting by Rembrandt, and we see Rembrandt's interpretation of a passage of Scripture, and that gives us a little bit of an illustration of what's going on here when we're just dealing with text, with language itself. But let's pick up where we left off and walk through this number of slides that deal, again, with translation and how that then leads us ultimately to understanding. So let me close out that and get to our PowerPoint. So let's begin by looking at the objective of reading is understanding. Obviously, to take text off of the page, bringing it into our mind. The whole point of the process is that we might understand what the author was trying to communicate. And reading is very valuable in that you don't necessarily need to have the author in your presence. He doesn't have to be sitting right there and walking you through what he's trying to communicate. He's put down his thoughts on paper or some medium of transference, and now we're hearing those words in our own mind coming off the page that he put there, and now we understand his thoughts. So he might be long dead. There's no way that we could actually talk with him. And what we're trying to reason through is, what was he trying to communicate through the words that he put on the page. So the objective of reading is understanding. It's not just busy work. It's not just to occupy our time. And I cannot recount to you the number of times that I would have taken a book and I've started to read it, and somewhere along the way my mind starts to wander, and I would read the whole page, but I really wouldn't have taken it in. I'd follow the words across the page, but none of the content was actually entering into my mind. I don't know if that's ever happened to you. I think it's quite a common experience. I've got to go back and reread that because I read it, but I didn't take the meaning out of what he said. I was just walking through the motions of reading, and I really wasn't allowing the understanding to penetrate. Well, so the true objective of reading is to understand what the author was trying to communicate. And now, especially going from one language to another and taking that and bringing that into a different language with different cultures, with different nuances of language, that becomes very, very difficult. And it only is through a great deal of effort that we can understand what the original author is trying to communicate. So if we keep in mind that the understanding is the objective for our reading, that might help us see why all of these processes are necessary. So we're trying to understand the intention of the author. So reading conveys that intention. But it, especially taking an ancient language, you need translation to bring it into the language that you speak, and then ultimately the interpretation of that process is extremely at point. So understanding, we need to kind of define that. Understanding equals meaning. And we'll see this a little more as we go through the course, but understanding is what we're really driving at. Meaning is communicated through interpretation. So these are some basic steps that I need you to understand and kind of hold in your memory bank. Meaning is what we're trying to ultimately achieve, and that meaning comes through interpretation. Translation, we could define it as bringing one language into another language by word or phrase transmission. And we'll see this as we go through this particular lecture. We're really going to dive into translation, and especially translation theory. Translations seem to juggle simultaneously the concept of meaning, vocabulary, and grammar. So we need to kind of define what vocabulary is, what grammar is, because translations are simultaneously juggling these three concepts of language. Languages are made up of vocabulary, languages are made up of grammar, and ultimately the meaning that's involved in the words on the page. That is what language is all about. And to translate from one language to another, you're in this process of juggling, and I think that's a great way of seeing the process, because at times one of these areas, whether it be vocabulary, whether it be grammar, whether it be meaning, all of this is being very fluidly operated through a process, and juggling is a great way of seeing this. And at times you might have two of the three up in the air, and you have your hand on one, you've got a real good grasp of it, but then it goes up in the air that you might take hold of vocabulary, or you might take hold of grammar. And so this process of juggling is extremely powerful imagery. So let's kind of dive into this in some detail. Language, let's just define this as having 5 common means of communication. And they consist of 5 categorical elements. So these elements we need to understand and then see how they apply to translation, and then ultimately to the meaning that is to be communicated. So 5 categorical elements that constitute communication. Okay, the first one are called phonemes. Phonemes. And if you just take the last couple of letters off of that word, you see the word phone. And we know that the word phone or phonics is a word that ties to the concept of sound. And so a phoneme is the individual bit of sound that is identified within a language. And I think to best understand these words that create these 5 categorical elements of language, illustration is the best way to do this. So I've taken the word bit and I've taken the word beat, and I'm using these two as illustrations of the individual sounds of a particular language. Now, when we talk about a phoneme, we're talking about the smallest individual sound that is a part of a particular language. And different languages have different phonemes. So the English language has a finite number of phonemes that help build the language. Think of these things as building blocks for the language that you speak. Your language, if English is not your is not your primary language, that native tongue, that first language of your life, has with it a certain number of phonemes. Now, that doesn't automatically translate into another language. And bit and beat, these two English words, illustrate this perfectly. So the word bit and beat both have consonants, B and T. B starts the word, T ends the word. And then there's a vowel sound in between the beginning letter and the last letter. The word bit has a I sound. That I sound is a phoneme. It's one of the very common sound elements of the English language. Now, there's another phoneme there. Bit is a part of the word. At the end of the word is another phoneme. So the word bit, the word beat, each have three phonemes, different sounds that combine together to make the word. Now, in the English language, the phoneme I that we would see in the word bit, that is a very powerful phoneme in the English language. We see it in numerous words, and sometimes we might even use different vowels in our writing to illustrate that sound. But nonetheless, in this particular illustration, we're using it in the word bit. But the word beat has a different phoneme in the middle of the word, and it differentiates the words. We English hearers would see or hear the word bit, we would hear the word beat, and immediately upon hearing that, our mind is driven to the definition of this particular word, where we understand it. There again, the meaning is being communicated because we've been trained to hear the word bit, we've been trained to hear the word beat. Now, it's interesting, in the Russian language, there is not this distinction. And so in the Russian language, you don't have that differentiation of the words bit and beat. So if a Russian native speaker comes and begins to learn English, because they have not been trained in the nuance of those phonemes, they don't hear it the way we do. They haven't been trained in it the way we are. And so when they learn the English language, they have an accent that comes over in the way they speak our language. So someone might go to the ER to see a doctor, and they talk about that their dog beat their arm. Well, what they're talking about is bit. They're trying to bring the word bit into the speech, but they're using the phonemes of the Russian language. And so they would say, your dog beat your arm? Well, then they would show the arm to the doc, and here you have dog teeth marks in the arm. And so we hear, the English speaker hear that the Russian is trying to say bit, but he doesn't use that kind of phoneme in his speech. And obviously then we can hear the Russian accent as he's trying to say the word bit. So that's kind of an interesting truth about languages, is that there are different sounds that actually are incorporated into the language. The last class, we looked at a Hebrew phrase, and at one point, I actually pronounced the words out of Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, and the last word in that phrase in Hebrew, I said, is the word ehud. We don't say ehud. in our English language. That's a very guttural sound, but that is a phoneme of the Hebrew language. It's a sound that is very familiar to them. It's found in numerous words in the Hebrew language. But when we translate the Hebrew into English, we don't bring over that phoneme. We don't use the h in any of our English words. So that gives you a little bit of an illustration of this categorical element that each language has, and many of these are unique to that particular language. So phonemes, number one. Number two are morphemes. Now, if you drop off the last four letters here, you have the word morph. And morph in the Greek language means shape. We see this in a number of English words. One of the most common is the word metamorphosis. That gives us a picture of the change of form from like a caterpillar to a butterfly, or from a tadpole to a frog. They go through a process of metamorphosis, a change of form. Morphology is the study of how things change in their shape. So here we're talking about a part of a word, the smallest part of a word that conveys a meaning. So now this small part of a word, and I'm using here the prefix un, that is a very small part of a word. And we call it a prefix. We would put the word un in front of all kinds of English words. Undeniable. Okay, what we've said there is we're negating the concept of deniability. Unforeseen. I don't have vision that takes me to the great distance to see what's coming. So something that is unforeseen, I didn't know it in advance. So the word, at least the prefix un, carries with it a meaning. It means to negate whatever follows. But the prefix un is made up of two phonemes. Un. And so here a morpheme is the smallest component of a word that conveys a meaning. Now I could take a very long word and break it out into the number of phonemes that it might have. It could have up to a dozen phonemes, depending on the length of the word. Undeniable. In fact, we might refer to these as syllables. This is the smallest component of the word that conveys a particular meaning, and you could just look at each of those elements of the word, those different syllables, and now we see that even this small little part of the word conveys a particular meaning. So this is part of the building of language, and how are these tied together is very important, because these do not always translate across from one language to another. So you can see the difficulty of translation building as we go. So translation is not just, taking one word, taking a word in a new language and using it to apply to this particular word of the ancient language. There are a number of categories that have to be addressed as the translation takes place. Okay, so you have phonemes, you have morphemes. Third one is you have lexemes. So here you're talking about the smallest word unit of a language that conveys meaning across the use of that word wherever you find it in the language. So here you might use the phrase root, a root word. So this is the smallest word unit in a language. And I've used as an illustration the word run. Okay, now with a lexeme, Again, you could drop off the last four letters of the word lexeme, the word lex, and we use a word that is defined by that idea of lexicon. And this is a dictionary. That's a fancy or more technical term than dictionary. The word lexeme has to do with meaning. Why do you go to a dictionary? You take a dictionary, open it up to find out the meaning of a word. So behind the word, you have this full definition. And this lexeme now is the smallest word unit in a language. We might refer to it as a root word. So you might see in the previous illustration, morpheme, we're taking the smallest part of a word that conveys meaning. Now, if we look at the prefix un in the morpheme, we would not say that un is a word. We would call it a prefix, which would define a part of a word. But now in a lexeme, we're talking about the smallest word unit. So this is a word, and now I've taken the word run to illustrate this particular aspect, this category. The word run, you could look upon this as a root word. So we've taken the word run as the illustration for what a lexeme is. It is the smallest word unit found in a language. In English, the word run means to run. Someone moving at a high speed as fast as they can motivate on their own without being in a vehicle. Someone in his own power making great speed, we call that running. Well, even in the use of the word running, I have used this root word run, or runs. She runs across the campus. We can also see that it is the root word for other tenses. We ran. They run. This is brought into the language to convey different tenses, different ways of expressing it for multiple people. But it all runs back to the word run, because that's the root. Now, so lexemes are very important in languages, and we see this in ancient languages and foreign languages. There are root words that build upon this concept of taking a root, adding to it prefixes, suffixes, and it changes the meaning slightly, but it all goes back to the root word. So those are called lexemes, the smallest word unit in a language that has a full meaning. Syntax is the fourth category that every language has. And this is the arrangement of words or phrases to create well-formed sentences in a language. And I've used here the idea of Jane ate lunch. Well, let's look at the word syntax. The word syntax, the prefix there, S-Y-N, brings to the foreground the idea of together. Wherever you see the prefix S-Y-N in the English language, it's, again, out of the ancient Greek language. It's brought over to us. But the idea is that you are bringing things together. So if I say, let's synchronize our watches, then we all look at our watch and we put it all at the same time. Now, if you don't have a watch, if you're using your telephone, and all the telephones are synced together, we use that word as well, synchronize. They're synced together because of the internet, but nonetheless, they are all reading the same time. They're together as they read the time. We see the prefix SYN in the word synagogue out of the scripture. And it's interesting that here is a place of gathering. The children of Israel come together in the synagogue. Even though it's a Greek word, they were living in a Greek culture of that day. And so the synagogue was the place they would come together. Well, so this idea of syntax, that languages need to be put together in such a form that there is well-formed sentences and there's meaning that is communicated. So Jane ate lunch. This is the way we in English would see the syntax, where you have a subject, Jane, and a predicate, ate, with a kind of a definer of what she ate. That's lunch. So the predicate is ate lunch, but this is well formed. This is the way we read and we write and we speak in English. This is the syntax, way a sentence put together. We don't speak like Yoda. Ate lunch, Jane. That's a different syntax. The way the Spanish language communicates, they put the adjective in front of the noun. We don't do that in English. We don't talk about the house white. We talk about the White House. But in Spanish, when they say La Casa Blanca, they're saying the house white. That's their syntax. And so obviously every language has to deal with the language as they speak it, as they write it. And then when you translate it, obviously translators need to rewrite it in a way that the new culture can understand it. So we would translate La Casa Blanca as the White House. That's the way we speak. So syntax is a very, very powerful category within languages and needs to be understood in the concept of translation. And finally, the last category is the idea of context. How do you find context before and after the particular word or phrase that helps the reader understand, or the hearer understand, what's being communicated? So just simply, context is what goes with the word or phrase that helps communication to be understood. Now, I used here as an illustration, bear with me. Okay, now maybe two different thoughts were communicated to the class when I said that. Maybe some of you heard the idea that, okay, there was a bear in the room with you. Bear with me, because obviously a bear can be the subject here. Could be referring to a big mammal that eats fish and bees and honey and ants, that lives in the Northwest. And so bears are very common in our world, and that's how you spell bear. That's how the pronunciation, that's how we hear the word for bear. So bear with me could be, okay, I'm in the same room with this big animal that could be dangerous for me. But some of you might have heard the idea, bear with me. I want you to take up a little bit of patience and hear me out. I want you to be long-suffering in your answers to whatever's going on in this situation, and I want you to just allow me an opportunity to communicate all that I have for you. So I want you to bear with me. So two different words, at least the meaning of bear, it's the same word, but it's really two words because of the meaning that we have here. Bear and bear do not mean the same thing, so we would say that these are two different words. If you were looking them up in the dictionary, they might all be put under one category, under the word bear, but then you'd have different definitions which would define the different words. We would call these antonyms, different than synonyms. Synonym means that we have a number of words that mean the same thing. Here's a word that actually has two different meanings, an antonym. And so immediately context tells us what we're talking about. The obvious comment that there's a bear with me is probably going to be followed by I protected myself. I made a barrier to where the bear couldn't get at me. But that idea then would be conveyed in the context, and then we would know exactly what we were talking about. So context is very important. And you can imagine that a language might have similar types of phraseology in their language, but to translate that over into English using different words for the same concept, antonyms and synonyms don't necessarily translate across languages perfectly. So those ideas need to be understood as we look at the difficulty there is in translating. So those 5 concepts, phonemes, morphemes, lexemes, syntax, and context, all are the categorical elements that help communication within a language. Now, let's tie that to the additional concepts of language that are necessary to understand. Those 5 components work together to create meaningful communication among individuals with the aid of these: grammar, which means the whole structure of the language. So grammar deals with the entire language in a structural format. We need to kind of understand grammar as the foundation upon which the house, the language, is built. So it does include syntax, obviously the way a sentence is positioned in phraseology and word placement. Syntax is very important to grammar, but also grammar includes how to put the lexemes in a certain way to where you have communication of tense, that you use this lexeme in this format to define whether it's past, present, or future. You also have punctuation. You also have paragraphs. And the way the whole of the structure of the language is defined, that is called grammar. I've used the wrong word in the wrong way in a sentence. And so that's a grammatical error. If I don't put the right punctuation in, I put a question mark at the end of the sentence when it's not a question, it changes the meaning. So grammar is the entire structure of the language. Now add to that semantics is the definition of word choice to convey meaning. Every now and again you'll hear the word semantics, where a particular word is being used and you say, are you sure you're using that word in the correct way to communicate exactly what you're saying? Because there are nuances within the language where a particular word might communicate better what you're saying by the use of a particular word rather than just a general concept. For instance, if I use the word like in reference to my wife, I like my wife. Well, do I like my wife? Yes. Do I use that in the marriage vows? I promise, I vow that I will like you the rest of our life. That really doesn't convey what I'm really trying to say at that moment. I vow that I will love you for the rest of our lives. That is a more powerful, more defining word than the word like. Or that you are dear to me. That doesn't convey all that the word love does. So here, semantics really, the word choice is extremely important. And so semantics needs to work inside the language as well. And we see this especially biblically, where a particular word choice is most definitely the right word, and another word choice may not fully convey what I'm trying to develop in my thesis. So that word choice is extremely important, and of course we refer to this as semantics. Now every now and again you'll have a word that in a language or in an argument is being used in a certain way, and someone is going to say, well, I think we're talking about the same thing. I don't like your word choice. It's just about semantics. But if that's the way you're defining the word you're using that I'm having difficulty with, then I can agree with you. But just because you're using it, you understand the word to mean the way you're using it, doesn't mean that the rest of the culture understands it the way you are. But it's a matter of semantics. And we would prefer that you use this word to convey what you're trying to say so that it is understood by all, or it's well recognized by everyone. So semantics, very important part of the concept of language. And again, the grammar and the semantics all have to tie back to the five categories that form the foundation of language: morphemes, phonemes, lexemes, syntax, and context. And the final one is pragmatics. This refers to how words are used in a practical sense. I want to use this particular word because it is so well known in the culture that the minute I use that word, everybody's mind goes to that understanding. And I'm not going to use that word in a different way in my communication, because it is so well understood that if I use that word, people are going to go immediately to that understanding. And if I'm talking about it in another way, I have to stop and define it so that I might communicate. Let's use the word church to define the pragmatics. Obviously, when I would use the word church and use it, just in a single statement, church, that automatically conveys a certain idea to every hearer, because we understand what churches are. They're buildings that you gather together on Sunday morning to worship the Lord, praise service, sermonettes, great teachings are done. This is what is the idea of church. However, if I wanted to take that word church and understand it in its nuances, well, ultimately we say that it's not so much the building, but it's the people. The people are the church. And so you might have the church gathered, and then you might have the church scattered. But it's still the church. There's still a connection of this group of people together. They may not be all in the same building, but they are the same church. But practically, I can use the word church, and we get it. We understand that. It's common to our language, and so it's very practical to use the word church in those ways. However, if you went back and actually looked at the full definition of the word church and found where it came from in its root, it actually means to be called out, for the idea of a gathering. So in the day before the internet, and the day before telephones, and the day before newspapers that would convey information, a town crier would run through the streets and call everyone to a meeting, a town hall meeting. And everyone would gather and then hear the instructions, hear the news, and then they would go and then be compliant. They would apply what they heard at the town meeting to their lives. Well, that idea of being called out of their homes and coming together and all hearing a similar word to help them in their next days of life, well, that term church began to be applied to the congregation that would gather on Sunday morning in a building and hear the word of the Lord. But when I use the word church in that phrase, in that form, I need to stop and define it. And so instead of using the word church without taking all the time, I might just say the word, we need to gather together and talk about something. Instead of using the word church, because that takes me into a completely different field of understanding. So pragmatics is a very important part of language as well, to use the right word at the right time for the practical sense that it conveys. So you have those 5 basic building blocks, the very simplest of forms on a number of these categories: phonemes, morphemes, lexemes, syntax, and context. These go with the idea of grammar, semantics, and pragmatics. So these 8 different areas, every translator has to deal with as they're putting together a new translation of an ancient language. Now, let's look at a little bit of a grid here that might help us see how you can see the difference between semantics and pragmatics. I think this is a great, let me pull that down, let us see it. So on the left-hand side, we have semantics. Compare that with pragmatics. So semantics is the study of words and their meanings within a language. Obviously, this word would have all of these particular aspects of meaning within this language. Pragmatics is the study of words and their meaning in a language with concern to their context. How is that word expressed in a proper way based upon the context within that language? Secondly, we look at semantics focuses on the significance of the meaning of words within a literal sense. So again, you might take a word and you see that this word means this every time in the language, but the literal doesn't always occur when you speak. Sometimes you use a word in a metaphorical way. So along with the semantics, what the word really means, there's the idea of adding focus on the meaning of a word according to the context and the inferences that we would try to convey. And this makes language very, very spicy, full of variety, full of ingenuity and ways of expressing. So again, I'm going to demonstrate this in a moment, but pragmatics are, okay, I could be using this word that always means this in a different way, but it's just context again that's going to help understand, deliver the understanding. Then there is the idea that there are studies of the literal meaning and then the studies of the intended or inferred meaning as well. So these are the differences in semantics and pragmatics. Now let's go on, and I'm going to show you some illustrations here. There is a translation philosophy that is on a broad spectrum. If you were with me in BI 111, the intro to Bible, we walked through this, but I'm going to take you a little deeper today in understanding what translation philosophy has to deal with from taking one ancient language and bringing it into the modern language. So let's walk through this PowerPoint slide and understand that whenever a translation is taking place, especially biblically, you're dealing with 2 different spectrums, the poles on a spectrum, I should say, and somewhere along those lines, a particular translator will decide this is the way I'm going to convey the ancient language into the modern language. I'm going to use this philosophy to treat the ancient language as I bring it over into the modern language. And the 2 poles are defined by the term literal correspondence and dynamic equivalence. This is the polar opposites on this translation theory spectrum. Literal correspondence, I think we could kind of break down the words here and see exactly what this means. Something that is literal is that you're having a perfect transference of thought. You're using the same idea in the new language that you did in the old language, and it is absolutely spot on a transfer of the meaning. So a literal correspondence is dealing in this sense, taking one word out of the ancient language and using a different word in the new language exactly corresponding to it. So with the word literal, we have the idea of bringing the exact word over from the ancient language into the modern language. And literal correspondence translations are very, very accurate in bringing over the same word over into the modern English out of the ancient language. And there's a correspondence that this word corresponds to this word, and it is exact. Compare that with the idea of dynamic equivalence. Dynamic, we get the understanding of a movement, that there's some fluidity there, that nothing is definitely exact. Something that is close or approximated, that is acceptable. And you have this moving equivalence or equality. Well, that's kind of an interesting phraseology. It almost sounds like it's a paradox. It's opposites that are kind of brought together, a dynamic, a fluid equivalence. Well, these are the technical terms. The basic way of understanding these two terms is literal correspondence means word for word. You're bringing over words out of the ancient language and using the same English word to translate that word every time in the new version. However, there, on the opposite side of the spectrum, you have this idea that it's not so much the word itself that needs to be conveyed, but the thought. What was the thought of the original translation? And now when you bring it into the new translation, you are carrying forward the thought. That's what's trying to be communicated. And these two philosophies are utilized in whatever translation you might pick up. We talked about last lecture that there has been an explosion of English translations in the last 50 years, and those are based upon one or the other of these two concepts. You can go to the preface of that particular translation, and you'll find somewhere in the writing of that preface the author's intent. What did he mean to communicate? And he'll tell you whether it is a literal correspondence or a dynamic equivalence translation. And that is important to understand as you're reading a particular translation, whether or not they are conveying word for word or whether it is a thought for thought. And here's the issue. That words carry with them domains of meaning. So a particular word doesn't necessarily only mean one thing. It could have a multiple way of expressing its meaning depending on context. And let me show you what I mean. And I use an illustration to drive this point home. And that's, let's take the word sharp, English word sharp. And immediately, the minute you hear the word sharp, pops into your mind a particular understanding of what that means. Well, let's kind of break down how the word sharp is used in our English language. Well, the first, I would guess the primary way that you first understood the word sharp when you thought of it is that it's a cutting edge or a very pointed instrument like a knife or a needle. And if you don't be careful, you'll be cut or injured. So the idea of cutting edge or pointing, that's very much the point of the word sharp. Now, that may not be the only way to use the word sharp. Some might say, well, wait a minute. I use the word sharp in the way I would express someone's wittiness or his intelligence. That person is sharp. And so here, the domain of meaning may overlap a little bit, that there's a little bit of quickness or penetration in the word sharp, and the intelligence and witty. But it doesn't mean that your mind is like a knife edge or point to a spear or needle. So sharp carries a different domain of meaning in the way we would use it. How about the word sharp in reference to a way a person dresses? That person is a snappy dresser, very sharp looking. Or how about someone using harsh words? That was a very sharp statement that they made there. Well, it's the same word sharp, but again, domains of meaning cross across these different ways of expressing ourselves based on our context. Something that's got a crystal clear image is extremely sharp. Or how about in music, where we might take a tone a half step up? That note was sharp. Or how about the tanginess of cheese? Sharp cheddar cheese. So domains of meaning have all kinds of different expression. So you can imagine, as in our English, you have words that have different domains of meaning, that across those domains, they may not even have any relationship whatsoever to the same definition. Tanginess of cheese, half a step up in music, cutting edge on a knife. How are all these defined by the word sharp? So if you've got those domains of meaning in one language, it doesn't necessarily mean they convey over to another language. So you can imagine, as they're translating a particular word out of the ancient, what's the domain of meaning in that word that we want to convey into the new translation? And that becomes a very difficult process. So the idea of taking a word and using another word in the new language every time may not convey the meaning based on the context of that particular text. I think as a good way of illustrating, let's take the word, Greek word sarx, out of the Greek New Testament. The Apostle Paul uses the word sarx over and over again, and that is a good translation for the word sarx is the word flesh, that the actual body that we have, the meat on our bones, is called flesh. Well, there's also spiritual concepts involved with that that the Apostle Paul brings to the word, and he'll use the word flesh in regards to a willful act. And so when the new translations are created, are you going to define the word itself, or are you going to define the thought that he's trying to convey? And this controversy arises in the heart. Which one is the best one to use? Well, some translations believe that if the Apostle Paul used the word sarx, we're going to use the word flesh every time, because it conveys a word for word or a literal correspondence to what the Apostle Paul wrote. But then you have some translators go, well, yes, but the word flesh does not always talk about the body or the meat on the bone. It's talking about a spiritual aspect. Let's define what that spiritual aspect is. Well, so you have translators that are interpreting for you, and many times they interpret it absolutely correctly, but sometimes they can interpret based upon their understanding, and it's not necessarily what the Apostle Paul meant. And so that's the controversy that's developed over translation, and especially translation philosophy. Let me show you how the Bibles are laid out. English. For instance, okay, you have this spectrum of translation philosophy, with the one pole being word for word, the other pole being thought for thought. Again, those technical terms, literal correspondence, dynamic equivalence, very, very important knowledge to hold in our mind. But let's see where our English translations fall. Well, the King James Bible it's more of a word for word translation than a thought for thought. So to translate it word for word, you might end up with the same issue with the La Casa Blanca and the White House. The wording may not fit exactly in the same pattern as you have in the ancient language as would be readable or understandable in English. So we really do not have a true word for word translation because we make the words fit into the English language to where it's understandable. So, but it's more on the word for word side of the scale than the thought for thought. Because when the Apostle Paul uses the word sarx, the King James translates it every time as the word flesh. And then they allow you, based upon the context of the passage, to come up with the meaning of the word sarx in that setting. So they leave the translation or the interpretation process up to the reader. Take, for instance, the NIV. It's more of a thought-for-thought translation. And as a result, we do not know, as you read the NIV, whether the Apostle Paul has used the word sarx or not, because they're not using the same word over and over again to define wherever he uses the word sarx. So the NIV is more of a thought-for-thought translation, and you actually have a great deal of the interpreter's, the translator's viewpoint on a particular thought than you do with the word-for-word translations, where they leave it up to you to make the interpretation. Compare that to the the Revised English Bible. This is more of a word-for-word, and it's harder to read than the King James. King James was written to be a pulpit Bible because not everybody had a copy of the Bible, and so you want the language to be very expressive and very pleasant to the ear. So the King James has that type of flavor to it. And when you think of the 23rd Psalm, you always hear it in the King James. When you read the Lord's Prayer, it's always in the King James because it's just such a beautiful, phraseology. However, the Revised English Bible is more of a word-for-word translation, and so it's a little choppier. It doesn't come over as flowing, as easy as the King James. Compare that with the New Living, which is even more of a thought-for-thought translation. In fact, it could almost be referred to as a paraphrase. It really doesn't carry every thought. Compare that with the Living Bible, which is even more of a paraphrase. Again, not every theological concept that is presented in the original language is going to be communicated in the Living Bible because they're looking at the main thought of a passage and conveying it in very, very rough terms, thought for thought wise. The NASB, New American Standard Bible, is even more of a word for word translation. And then you have the English Standard Version and the Revised Standard Version falling somewhere in between the two. So this gives you an idea of the way translators will use this philosophy to create their particular versions. Let me show you this last slide, and this one is just taking the 15 most popular Bibles and looking at their reading level, grade-wise. So, for instance, when you're dealing with the NIV, the NIV Bible is written for 7th and 8th grade readers. So it is not as technical. It doesn't carry as many theological words in it as for instance, the King James Bible is found over here, and it's on a 12th grade reading level. The RSV is in a 12th grade reading level, and these are the only two Bibles that really are in the more difficult age groups to read. Compare that with some of these that are all written on a 3rd grade level, making it very easy for even a young child to read. But this gives you a little bit of the idea of the way the biblical translations are laid out. And I won't ask any of this on a test, but it gives you a pretty good way of understanding how a passage is conveyed and to what kind of reading level it is communicating. Okay, we'll pick it up on this slide starting next time in the next lesson. But pretty good introduction to translations and how the language is built. And then that demonstrates the difficulty it would be to translate from one language to another. I'll talk to you soon.